I was a kid sitting in a movie theater. On the screen, a group of mutants just walked into a dwelling and found out what they thought were dead apes. And then Caesar, played by Roddy McDowall, rose up from the ground and shouted, "Now fight like apes." The apes surged to life, the battle began, and the audience, a theater full of human beings, mostly my age, around 12, 13, what have you, erupted in cheering. Now, they were cheering for their own destruction. And I, as a kid, was genuinely puzzled by this. And I spent most of my life trying to figure out why. And today, we're going to figure it out together. Welcome back to Psycho Cinema Therapy Theater. I'm Dwayne Walker, and today we're going inside the villain, and more importantly, inside you, to find out what the villains you love are actually saying and actually trying to tell you about yourself. Now, in the last episode, we talked about what your favorite movie says about you. Today, we go deeper, because there's a question that many people don't even think to ask. Why do we root for the villains? Not occasionally, not by accident, but consistently, passionately, sometimes embarrassingly. We root for Tony Soprano, we root for Walter White, we root for Hannibal Lecter, a man who eats people, and somehow we find him charming. Is it because he has an English accent? I don't know. And of course, we root for the apes over humanity itself. What is that about? The easy answer is that we're drawn to power, or charisma, or good writing. All those things are true, but they're only surface answers. They don't explain the feeling, that particular combination of attraction and recognition that the best of villains produce in us. That feeling has a name in psychology. It's called the shadow. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who spent his life mapping the terrain of the unconscious, described the shadow as parts of yourself where you push out of awareness. Not just the dark parts, not just the violent or selfish impulses, all of it. Anger, ambition, desire, grief, the hunger for power, the hunger for freedom, the parts of you that wanted to say something, but you didn't. The version of you that you wanted to walk away, but you stayed. The person that you could have been if you would have made different choices. Whatever was deemed too dangerous, too inconvenient, too unacceptable by your family, your culture, your own internal censor, got exiled into the shadow. And here's the thing about the exiled parts of the self. They don't disappear. They wait. And when the lights go down in a movie theater, they wake up. Because on the screen, the shadow gets a body. It gets a voice. It gets a leather coat and a great monologue, and it does everything you were told you couldn't do. That's the villain. That's why you can't walk away. That's why you can't look away. Now let me tell you about the second time I had a profound experience in a movie theater. I was in college, and I was in the middle of a long, tense conflict with my father regarding my academic choices. He wanted me in certain classes. I had my own idea about the future, and the conversations weren't going well. And then Return of the Jedi came out. Now, at this point in the saga, Darth Vader had told Luke that he was his father, and there was a faction of Christian fans who were convinced Vader was lying. Their reasoning? The devil is the father of lies. Star Wars operates on the principles which they interpreted as Christian. Therefore, Vader must be deceiving Luke. I latched onto that theory, not for theological reasons, but for personal reasons. I needed Vader to be lying because I needed a story where the dark, controlling, seemingly all-powerful father figure was wrong. Where you could look him in the face and say, "No, you don't get to define me. You're not even telling the truth." I walked into Return of the Jedi wanting Luke to reject him completely. Well, George Lucas didn't give me that. Vader was Luke's father, and Luke, to my great frustration at the time, chose compassion. How un-American. He chose to see the man behind the mask. Chose integration over destruction. And I left that theater genuinely disappointed. And I spent years understanding why that moment mattered so much to me. Why Vader, the villain, was carrying something that I couldn't carry myself. He represented part of my own story that I hadn't resolved. The shadow of a difficult parental relationship at the time that I hadn't found a way to face directly. That's what villains do when they're working at full power. They carry what we can't yet hold. So let's get specific, because not all villain attraction is the same. Just like the last episode when we talked about the 4 different types of favorite films, there are distinct psychological patterns behind which the villains capture us. And each one points to something different living in your shadow. Type 1. The villain who says what you can't. This is the villain who speaks the unspeakable, who walks into a room and says exactly what everyone is thinking but nobody will admit. Think of Hans Landa in The Inglourious Bastards, the Joker in The Dark Knight, Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. These characters are terrifying partly because they're honest. They've simply removed the social filter that a lot of us spend enormous energy maintaining. The truth. What truth are you sitting on that feels too dangerous, too socially unacceptable, too likely to cost you something important? The villain is saying it for you, and part of you, that part that's tired of performing the acceptable version of yourself, is grateful. Type 2. The villain who refuses to stay small. This is the villain who decided that the life they were given was not enough and took matters into their own hands. Walter White, Tony Montana, Macbeth. The seduction here isn't really about crime or power in the abstract. It's about expansion. These characters refuse the box that was built for them. They reach for something larger, even when, especially when, it destroys them. If this type of villain speaks to you, the question is, where in your life have you decided to stay small? What version of yourself have you abandoned because someone convinced you it was too much, too ambitious, too presumptuous, too far outside what people like you are supposed to want? That villain didn't listen to that voice, and part of you wishes that you hadn't either. Type 3. The villain who wants justice that nobody will give them. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex type. The villain whose origin is legitimate grievance, who was wrong, genuinely wronged, and found out that the system offered no remedy. Magento, Killmonger, the Phantom of the Opera, even Caesar from the Planet of the Apes films. Yes, Caesar. The audience in that theater wasn't cheering for violence against humans. They were cheering for a character who had been oppressed, controlled, and then denied its own injustices. If justice-seeking villains move you the most, the question is, where do you feel unheard? Where have you experienced something genuinely unfair and been expected to absorb it quietly, to forgive without acknowledgement, to move on without resolution? The villain didn't move on. And part of you, the part that's tired of being reasonable about unreasonable things, is watching. Type 4. The villain you hate the most. Now this one is different, and it's the most revealing of all. I'm not asking which villain you love. I'm asking which villain makes your skin crawl beyond reason. The one whose scenes make you tense, whose worldview enrages you. Genuinely. Whom you can't watch without a visceral physical response. Jung called this the shadow of the shadow. The thing we condemn most loudly in others is often, not always, but often, the thing we fear the most in ourselves. The trait that disgusts you in the villain usually points you to something that you're working very hard to suppress, not because you are that thing, but because some part of you worries that you could be, or has been, or wanted to be. This is uncomfortable territory, but it's also some of the most valuable psychological information you'll ever encounter if you're willing to look at it honestly. They're a mirror you'd rather not look into. So, what to do with all this? I want to be clear about something. None of this means you secretly want to become a villain. None of this is an endorsement of what those characters do. The shadow is not a permission slip. It's a signal. Jung was very specific about this. The goal isn't to become the shadow. The goal is to integrate it, to acknowledge what's been exiled, to understand why it has been exiled, and to find legitimate channels for the energy that's been locked up in it. The person drawn to villains who say the unspeakable doesn't need to start burning bridges. They need to find their authentic voice in their actual life. The person drawn to villains who refuses to stay small doesn't need to break laws. They need to give themselves permission to take up more space. The person drawn to justice-seeking villains doesn't need to rage. They need to grieve what was unfair and find somewhere to put that grief other than a locked room. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It just wants to be seen. So, I think about that kid in the theater all the time, watching the audience cheer for the apes, sitting there confused by his own species. What I understand now that I didn't understand then is that the audience was not rooting for destruction. They were rooting for a part of themselves that had been controlled, dismissed, and underestimated. Caesar wasn't a villain to them. He was the shadow made heroic, the repressed thing that finally stood up and said, enough. The line between villain and heroes is often just a matter of whose story we're inside. And the line between the villain on the screen and the shadow inside us is sometimes thinner than we would like to admit. In the next episode, we're going to look at something that we all have but we rarely examined. The films we're ashamed to love. The guilty pleasures. The so bad they're good films. We watch alone at midnight with the curtains closed because those movies, well, they might be the most psychologically honest thing about you. I'm Dwayne Walker, and this is Psycho Cinema Therapy Theater. See you in the dark. So drop your favorite villains in the comments. No judgments here. This is a safe space. Tell me who it is, and I'll tell you what I see. Let's find out what's living in your shadow. And if episode 1 hits something real for you, share it. The people who need this kind of conversation are out there. Let's find them.